For 20 years, my overly kind husband had been sending money to his parents out of filial duty. Even though our household finances are tight, we have never once received a word of thanks. Instead, all we heard was,
"What are you acting so proud about with just $1,000?
To make matters worse, we recently discovered the shocking truth that our money has been secretly going to my sister-in-law. My mother-in-law said,
"If you give us a new house, we'll stop asking for money."
Fed up with the unreasonable demands of my husband's kindness, my anger finally exploded. "Fine, we'll buy you a house. My name is Nancy, and I'm 49 years old. I married my husband, Jason, 24 years ago when I was 25. We've been through a lot, but we're still a happy couple. Now that our children are grown, my husband and I have just talked about enjoying our time together. However, there was one big problem. Both my husband and I were at an age where we needed to save for retirement, but the money we sent to his parents was a significant obstacle. For the past 20 years, we'd been sending money to my in-laws every month. The amount was $1,000, which was quite substantial. While this might be manageable for a wealthy family, it was a significant burden for us, despite both of us working. It was especially tough when our children were growing up and expenses were high. During those difficult times, we asked if we could reduce or pause the payments. However, my mother-in-law became furious, exclaiming,
"Are you abandoning your parents?"
Any attempts to explain our situation, like we're struggling with our children's education expenses, were met with no understanding. She retorted,
"You got married and had children all thanks to us. How ungrateful."
While there was some truth to her words, did she really need to hold it over us like that? We'd heard such remarks countless times. My husband said he would handle it, but as a couple, we supported each other. So, I took on the responsibility of the payments, leaving our household finances to my husband. He was strongly opposed, but since I earned a bit more, I decided to bear the burden. That was how we'd managed to get by financially until that time. By the way, despite the verbal abuse from my parents-in-law, we'd never received a word of thanks from them. My mother-in-law said things like,
"Your income exists for us. Be grateful for how we raised you and send us money."
My father-in-law adds,
"The only reason our incompetent son managed to get married is thanks to us."
They often say such awful things to my husband. Were they really his parents? I often got angrier than my husband. However, he just gave a bitter smile and said,
"It can't be helped. They've always been like this."
Seeing him so resigned to their behavior pains me. Even so, since my husband didn't talk back to his parents, I couldn't complain to them either as his wife. These 20 years had been filled with frustration. It would be much easier if my husband's sister, Amy, would at least share the burden of the support payments. I've never seen my sister-in-law being criticized by her parents, unlike my husband. Instead, she's showered with compliments like,
"She's such a beauty,"
from my mother-in-law. Also she would remark,
"She looks just like me when I was young."
Even my father-in-law says,
"Just by being born, she's already fulfilling her filial duty."
The stark difference in attitude toward my husband and her always irritated me, though I've never expressed my anger since my husband always tries to pacify me with a simple,
"It's okay."
He was too kind, wasn't he? Sure, his kindness was one of the reasons I fell for him, but I believed it was okay to be more assertive. Sometimes I felt like my husband took his position as the eldest son too seriously. It was not common to be considered as being the eldest or being a son nowadays. I've even heard him tell our son,
"You don't have to worry about taking care of us when we're older."
Maybe he said that because he's had a tough time with his own parents. However, even though my husband accepted it, I couldn't understand. At least once, I wanted my mother-in-law to express gratitude. When I was alone with my mothers-in-law, I asked, regarding the financial support, I'd be glad if you could express your gratitude to my husband occasionally. At that moment, my mother-in-law looked puzzled. Then she said,
Isn't it natural for a son to provide financial support to his parents? Why should I have to say, thank you?
She completely failed to understand what I said. Instead, her attitude was like if I was the one who was strange. I was speechless at such a response. I was taken aback. But she appreciated her daughter, Amy, even the little things. My mother-in-law praises.
She's such a kind daughter, visiting her parents despite being busy.
Amy only went home about once a year, sometimes just for a day. In contrast, we visited once a month, and we were often called over for this and that. Usually, we were given tasks to do, but we've never been thanked once. Was there such blatant discrimination? However, judging by my husband's behavior, it seemed he's been treated this way for a long time. In what seemed like a confirmation of my husband's accounts, the photo albums always depicted him as a child with a melancholic expression. His clothes often appeared hand-me-downs or ill-fitting, and there were numerous instances where they seemed too tight. In contrast, Amy always wore charming and neat attire. Interestingly, there were no pictures of my husband's birthdays, yet Amy's lavish birthday photos adorned his album. My father-in-law adamantly declared,
You must attend a public high school, and we won't cover university expenses.
Which led my husband to rely on student loan to pursue higher education. Conversely, Amy was given the freedom to attend her preferred private high school. Although her parents funded her college education, she dropped out due to a carefree lifestyle, without any reprimand from them, simply dismissed by my mother-in-law with a resigned,
Well, that's just how it is.
My father-in-law even went as far as saying,
Going to college and accruing debt through student loans is foolish.
Which was utterly unfair. Furthermore, my husband was expected to provide financial support, yet there were no demands made towards their daughter. In fact, Amy lacked the financial means to provide such support. She quickly quit jobs, struggled to maintain part-time work, and ultimately became unemployed. Despite leading a carefree, unemployed life, her parents still doted on her. I was left speechless when my mother-in-law instructed me during our marriage proposal visit.
Make sure to give our daughter a monthly allowance.
When that daughter got married and left home, we were then stunned to be commanded to provide financial support to my parents-in-law. Despite enduring all this, I thought my husband was more like a commendable figure than a pitiable one, because he never refused to abandon his parents. However, I couldn't simply suggest cutting ties since I was not related by blood. It was a delicate and complicated issue that has been weighing heavily on my mind for a long time. Even during the challenging times of raising children, we continued to provide financial support. It was high time we received some gratitude. However, no matter what we said or did, my husband's parents never expressed gratitude. They never wavered from their belief that they were entitled to receive support. One day, I received a phone call from my mother-in-law. Generally, my parents-in-law were completely indifferent to our family. They didn't even care when our children were born. All they were concerned about was the financial support. Naturally, our children didn't warm up to their grandparents and naturally drift apart. Whenever they called, it was always for some selfish reason or to ask for an extra allowance. With a sinking feeling whenever my phone rang, I reluctantly picked up. Hello?
Hey, what's up with this month's allowance?
Without any greeting, she dived straight into it, leaving me exasperated as usual. While I regretted not being able to show my burning anger, I replied, "Allowance is always on the 30th, which is tomorrow." To which she said,
"That's not the point. I need an extra $500 this month."
"Huh? So, you mean $1,500? That's a bit." When I hesitated, my mother-in-law immediately snapped.
"What do you think the parent is?"
Well, it was the usual. She probably expected me to comply if she used intimidation tactics. But after 24 years of marriage, I've grown accustomed to her attitude. "What do I think you are?" "Well, you're the parent, right?"
"Then just give us the extra."
"No, we're already providing support."
"I said I want more."
"It's just not possible. Sorry."
"More."
"Impossible. Impossible." Perhaps she sensed my nonchalant demeanor because my mother-in-law abruptly hung up, saying,
"This conversation is going nowhere."
Well, I thought I handled it with sincerity, but maybe it didn't come across that way. Phones can be tricky, huh? That evening, when I reported the phone call incident to my husband, he chuckled and said,
Only you could pull off that kind of attitude with my mom. Your natural charm is something else.
"Natural charm? I'm not particularly charming," I replied. "I'm just conveying what you couldn't say. Once we increase the allowance, they'll keep expecting the same. I want to cut down on expenses for our retirement, so you have to say no, okay?"
Yeah, I get it.
My husband nodded, but he seemed uneasy. And his unease proved valid.
Dad just told me to increase the allowance to $1,500 starting next month.
My response slipped out involuntarily. "Here we go," I muttered. "You didn't agree to it, did you?"
Of course not.
My husband reassured. "What did your dad say?"
He thinks we should have plenty of money since the kids are independent now. And asked, what do you think we are?
I can imagine your dad saying that." I sighed.
Haha.
My husband chuckled nervously. "It's not funny." I glared at him, and his smile faded. "You have to say no, no matter what."
Yeah.
He mumbled. However, a few days later on a holiday morning, my parents-in-law barged in, causing a commotion. My mother-in-law shouted,
"Increase the allowance, you bossy wife."
It seemed she blamed me for not being able to increase the allowance. So, I threw popcorn at her. "Here, have some." My mother-in-law asked,
"What's this?"
"Since you think I'm such a devil wife, why don't you try it too?" My mother-in-law exclaimed,
"All right then. Here I go."
Just because I said it was okay to throw didn't mean she'd actually do it seriously, right? So, I retorted, "Well, since you're annoying too, here it comes." My mother-in-law screamed, "It's okay. Come on, open your mouth wide," I said.
"Huh? Wide?"
I promptly threw popcorn into her mouth. My mother-in-law choked.
"Blah."
Even though she obediently opened her mouth wide as I said, "She's quite naive." While my mother-in-law and I were goofing around throwing popcorn at each other, my husband and father-in-law were discussing things with serious expressions. My husband asked,
Why do you need so much money in the first place? You still have your retirement savings, and there's also your pension, right?
My father-in-law replied,
With the rising cost of living, it's not enough.
My husband insisted.
We need to think about our retirement too.
My father-in-law retorted,
What retirement? First, You should worry about your parents.
Like my mother-in-law, my father-in-law seemed to think yelling at us would make us understand. My husband has faced many unfair situations since he was a child. As I threw popcorn at my mother-in-law, I silently cheered. "Hang in there, Jason." And somehow, my husband must have felt my support because he firmly said,
It's impossible. If you really need money, ask Amy.
"Oh, that's a valid point." Just as I was impressed, my mother-in-law aggressively threw popcorn at me as if in retaliation, so I hit back with a newspaper bat. But my father-in-law said,
There's no way I could ask her.
and got mysteriously angry.
I thought Amy was struggling, so I wanted to help with the allowance. Oh no.
Wait a minute, what's going on here? I paused with the newspaper bat poised to strike, and then popcorn came flying at me. Ignoring it, I looked at my father-in-law. Even my husband was frozen in surprise.
What's that about? Did you, by any chance, give our allowance to Amy?
My husband cut straight to the point.
It shouldn't matter. It's our money, and we can do what we want with it.
No, it's Nancy's money, isn't it?
I received it, so it's mine. What's wrong with using it for what I want?
Then I'll just give the allowance directly to Amy. What are you taking credit for? Amy probably doesn't even know it's from us.
Of course not. Fathers want to look good to their daughters.
Stop messing around.
My husband finally lost his temper, understandably so. The allowance we've been giving for our parents all this time, thinking it was for their sake. Even though it was coming out of my salary, it was essentially our family's money. We'd endured not going on trips as a couple and sacrificing to keep sending it, but this was just too much. Finally, tears welled up in my husband's eyes. These tears were probably more filled with frustration than sadness. As his wife, I understood his feelings well. My husband had endured being treated differently from his sister for so long. Despite that, he continued the allowance for his parents' sake. Only to find out it was for their daughter. No wonder even my gentle husband would be angry. Overwhelmed with shock, my husband silently continued shedding tears. I gently placed my hand on his back and stared daggers at our parents. Both of you have gone too far. For the past 20 years, we've been sending allowances and all you do is criticize us. Favoring Amy behind our backs. It's so unfair to my husband. No words of gratitude for us, and now you talk about increasing it? Stop kidding yourselves. There was no need to endure it anymore. I said it bluntly, not just for my husband's sake, but for ours. Then, instead of feeling flustered, both of them chuckled smugly.
Pretentious over a mere $1,000.
Surely, they were underestimating that their kind son would never abandon them. That was certainly not wrong. But my husband had not only his parents but also me, his important spouse. Shall I throw the popcorn again? I glared, and my mother-in-law laughed.
Your father's right. Acting all high and mighty over $1,000. You should say such things after gifting us a new house.
Huh?
If you do that, you won't need to send allowances anymore. Well, it's probably impossible anyway. So the increase is a must.
Fine. I'll take you up on that.
Huh?
To dismiss my mother-in-law's absurd demand for an increase based on her mysterious logic, I nodded. Both of them looked bewildered. It's fine. I'll buy the house for you.
Really?
Both of them stared wide-eyed at my words. Even my husband looked at me in astonishment. Please don't look at me like that. while thinking it was not that big of a deal. I smirked. Several months later. The house is ready. I called my in-laws to the newly built house. Here it is, your new home, where you'll spend the rest of your days. With a beaming smile, I led them inside. It was a very large single-story house, more than spacious enough for a couple to live comfortably.
What's this?
My mother-in-law's astonished voice prompted me to proudly spread my arms. Look at this vast land. A garage big enough for several cars. You could turn it into a farm or put effort into gardening. Maybe even keep lots of goats or other animals.
Wait a moment.
But above all, look at the size of this house. And this traditional thatched roof. It's a rare experience in this area.
Wait, just a moment.
You've never had an experience like this before, have you?
Wait a minute.
No electricity or gas. It's the ideal old-fashioned farmhouse. Now, enjoy country living to the fullest.
Just wait a second, hold on.
Interrupting my increasingly excited speech, my mother-in-law shouted with a bright red face. What's going on? You're too excited.
Where on earth is this place?
It's a secluded house deep in the mountains, I proudly announced. You've seen these kinds of houses on TV, right, in the mountains? And now, it was right in front of us. Impressive, wasn't it? As I looked at my mother-in-law with a smug expression, she stared back, then suddenly snapped, startled by the situation.
Why do you find such inconvenient places? And what's with this rundown house? I heard we were getting a new house built, so I expected something brand new, but this definitely looks secondhand.
What are you talking about? It's a brand new house built using all reclaimed materials from an old house.
So basically, you dismantled an old house that couldn't be lived in and rebuilt it with its materials?
It's perfectly livable now, so there's no issue.
No, at least install gas and electricity.
Why?
Why? You.
My mother-in-law looked at me with a defeated expression as I tilted my head. What's the problem? You asked for a house to be built, so I did it. Why are you unhappy?
I have nothing but complaints.
Rolling my eyes at their extravagance, I glanced at my husband, who wore a very complex smile. But, if you've been given a house as a gift, you'll stop the allowance, right?
Huh?
It's not a huh, right? I asked my father-in-law.
Isn't a new house supposed to have the scent of wood and be fully equipped with brand new walls?
It is a newly built house. I glared at my father-in-law, who fell silent, realizing it was not the time to nitpick.
Hold on. We can't live in a place like this. I'm going back to our old house for now. Get the car and take me back.
As my father-in-law stood dumbfounded and my mother-in-law continued to raise her voice, I replied with a cheerful laugh. It's all good.
What's good about it? It's definitely not good at all.
As a token of gratitude for repurposing this super rural, secluded house in the mountains, the previous owner left behind various furniture for us. You can start living here right away. Oh, and the vegetables in the backyard garden seem to be ready for harvest.
Huh?
So, let's embrace self-sufficiency.
What?
Living here will surely rejuvenate you. This house definitely has the vibe of a friendly spirit, and it'll bring you good luck.
A friendly spirit? Are you serious?
I'm always serious, I said firmly, and she gave me a look of extreme displeasure. Why? Just a 30-minute walk from here. There's a bus stop. With that, I left with my husband in the car. Well, I was thrilled. They were so happy they could cry. It was worth splurging on buying the house. With the incredible deal we got on the land and the previous owner covering the reconstruction costs, my parents-in-law must have been touched. I'll just pretend I didn't hear it when my husband muttered.
Naturally terrifying.
Anyway, I bought them a house and fulfilled their wish. It was not perfect, but it was livable, so let's count it as a win. With the allowance finally ending, we could now start saving for ourselves. Hooray! One day, just when I was thinking everything was going smoothly, I received a phone call. It was from my father-in-law.
What's going on?
Getting yelled at out of the blue. What's that all about? Apparently, my parents-in-law couldn't adapt to life in the mountains and ended up returning to their old house. Well, that was their choice, their prerogative, you know.
We tried to sell that house to get some cash, but it's not selling.
Well, it's a remote location, so finding a buyer might be tough, right?
That's not it. We consulted with a real estate agent, and they said it could appeal to people dreaming of country living. We thought we'd have buyers lined up.
Oh, I see. Seemed like there was demand for retiring to the countryside quietly or giving their weary urban souls a break.
But I can't sell it.
And he was shouting.
What's the deal? It's not in my name.
I could imagine my father-in-law on the other end of the phone, his face red with anger. Well, yeah, that's true. I replied in a hushed tone, as if to say, what nonsense are you talking about?
What did you say? Did you deliberately put the house in your name?
So, that secluded house in the mountains that I bought for my parents-in-law was actually in my name. What was so strange about that?
It's strange. That's my house, the one I received. So why isn't it in my name?
Well, because I bought it.
Huh?
What's strange about the buyer's name being on the deed?
What's strange is... Huh?
I could hear the despair in my father-in-law's voice. It's really quite simple. I tilted my head in confusion. I bought the house, and it's perfectly fine for you and your wife to live there. It's straightforward, isn't it?
I asked you to buy it.
And so I did.
No. But...
I could almost picture my father-in-law feeling exasperated on the other end of the phone. But I really couldn't understand what he was saying. In the first place, my father-in-law didn't negotiate with the real estate agent when we bought the house. He didn't even remember signing any documents. Why did he think it would be in his name? It was bizarre.
Anyway, change the deed to my name quickly. I'll sell that inconvenient house right away.
Why? Living with a friendly spirit isn't something you can just do.
There's no friendly spirit. And I wouldn't want to live there even if there was.
What a luxurious complaint. Living in a house where there was no rent or mortgage. What's the problem? I really didn't get it. I think, if you want to give money to Amy, a house in the mountains with no utility bills would be perfect. I said.
That's right, Amy. Amy is the problem again.
Seemingly recalling something suddenly, my father-in-law raised his voice.
She's asking for help with the down payment for her new house.
Oh, I see. I replied, wondering what that had to do with us. My husband was increasingly fed up with his parents' blatant favoritism and discrimination. Amy seemed to take her parents' support for granted, and she and my husband had grown distant. So, I didn't really care about Amy's situation, but... You're free to help her if you want. I suggested.
We were planning to sell the house in the mountains for money. But the plan failed. You two should take responsibility and provide the money.
No, thank you. I cut in, rejecting the idea outright, and hung up the phone. Immediately, the phone rang again. Annoyed, I answered, and my father-in-law shouted,
If you don't want to, then put the house in my name.
And again, I replied firmly, No, thank you. The phone kept ringing with demands like,
Give us money. Change the deed.
Each time, I responded with a firm, No, thank you. Finally, my father-in-law's tone softened to a pleading one.
Please give us the money.
Matching his tone, I replied tearfully, No, thank you. And after that, the phone attacks stopped. Phew. That evening, when my husband returned from work, he told me that his parents had called his office.
They asked me to do something about my naive wife.
He chuckled as he reported this to me.
Of course, I have no intention of doing anything.
He smiled. But they continued to send letters and occasionally visit our home, persistently demanding house, money, deed, and so on. Fed up, I finally said, Next time, we'll give you a new, freshly built house as a gift. And finally, the relentless attacks stopped. After a while, my husband and I went to my parents' house. My mother-in-law said,
This time it's really a newly built house, right?
So, I nodded vigorously and said, Yes, I built it. My father-in-law looked satisfied and exchanged glances with my mother-in-law. He asked,
Oh, really? By the way, where is it? We don't need another house in the middle of nowhere in the mountains.
I reassured him. Don't worry. Whether it's in the city or anywhere else, you can put it wherever you like. Perplexed, my father-in-law asked,
Put it wherever? What do you mean?
So, I repeated, You can put it wherever you like. Confused, they both tilted their heads in unison as I dramatically placed a package I had secretly brought with me. My mother-in-law exclaimed,
What is this?
It was a large parcel that would surely excite her. This is something you'll love for sure. It's that kind of house, I said proudly. She replied,
Huh?
I then unveiled the contents of the large package. What appeared was a miniature version of a grand mansion. My father-in-law exclaimed,
What in the world is this?
My mother-in-law gasped.
What? A dollhouse?
My father-in-law was shocked and his eyes widened, and my mother-in-law was bewildered. Puffing out my chest proudly, I declared, Isn't it amazing? I made this. My mother-in-law was astonished.
Huh?
I'm actually quite skilled at crafts. I make dioramas as a hobby, I explained. My mother-in-law couldn't believe it.
What?
I continued. This is indeed a house I built. Please accept it. She exclaimed in disbelief.
What?
It was a dollhouse that any little girl would be delighted with. Looking at their stunned expressions, I thought to myself, I did a good job. I was glad that they were so delighted that they could say nothing. Especially, I hoped my mother-in-law could play with it. My husband and I left my parents' house, leaving them speechless. It seems like they were both really pleased. That's great, I said to my husband, who replied,
You're so goofy.
I refrained from saying, I'm not goofy, it's intentional, and just stuck my tongue out inwardly. After that, the two of them kept bothering me with various messages, but I ignored them all. Eventually, they quieted down when they realized their attempts to impose on me were futile. Just when I had forgotten about them, I received a call from a relative. It turned out, the two of them were strapped for cash and had been begging for money everywhere. Apparently, in a bid to impress their daughter Amy, they sold their previous house and offered financial support for Amy's new home. When Amy asked them to live together in the new home, they agreed to help, but as soon as they sold the house and handed over the money, communication ceased, leaving their plans to live in the new home in ruins. In other words, Amy had used them to her advantage. Like parents, like children. My husband, who doesn't resemble that family at all, must be a genetic mutation or something. Abandoned by their daughter and estranged from their son and daughter-in-law, the two of them, rejected after begging for money everywhere, eventually found themselves in that lonely house again. Well, at least it provides shelter from the rain and wind. I'm glad my purchased house could be of some use in its odd way. Amy, who deceived her own parents, got what was coming to her. Raised by indulgent parents into an incredibly selfish daughter, she ended up having a big fight with her husband and got a quick divorce. The reason for the fight was Amy's infidelity. It turned out that the money she received from her parents was actually spent on her affair. Again, like parents, like children. It's a complete mystery how my husband turned out to be a decent human being. Perhaps it's because he wasn't raised properly by those parents. Amy, with nowhere else to go, apparently headed to the same lonely house where her parents reside, and is now living with them. However, with a daughter who betrayed them after being spoiled rotten and those stubborn parents, there's no way they can get along well. Amy, who's now unwilling to work, relies solely on her parents' pension for a poor quality of life. As for me, with that annoying allowance gone and freed from the shackles of my husband's parents, I finally felt like I could breathe freely after a long time. Now that we have some breathing room, let's go on a trip, I suggested excitedly as we looked through a stack of brochures from travel agencies.
Nancy, I'm sorry for everything. Thank you.
He said, taking me by surprise. Seeing the relief on his face, as if a burden had been lifted, I simply nodded and replied, "Sure." I said, "Let's spend a happy retirement together, my dear." I could see his gentle smile, which I adore.